Hello, my name is Hannah, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Tasmania. Thanks for watching my keynote presentation. I'm going to be discussing a fascinating and misunderstood eruption, the 1886 eruption of Tarawera, New Zealand, which was a basaltic Plinian eruption. This eruption was the largest and deadliest of New Zealand's historical eruptions, and it represents a significant cultural event in New Zealand's history. We found some surprising textures in these rocks which are different from literature and indicate an odd behavior of crystallization and vesiculation within the ascending magma. The 1886 Tarawera eruption represents an explosive end member to basaltic volcanism. Basaltic volcanism is typically characterized by effusive to mildly explosive eruptions, such as the lava flows and lava fountaining observed in Hawaii, and also strombolian eruptions, which are typical of Mount Etna and Stromboli volcano. The explosive end member of volcanic eruptions is called a Plinian eruption. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens is a perfect example. Basaltic volcanism is typically not highly explosive due to the low viscosity and the low volatile content of basaltic magma. Basaltic Plinian eruptions are the rarest, most extreme, and least understood end members on the spectrum of mafic events. There are only 4 well-documented basaltic Plinian eruptions on Earth: 2 within the Masaya caldera in Nicaragua, 1 at Etna volcano, and the most recent at Tarawera. Although the hazards posed by highly explosive basaltic eruptions are considerable, controlling mechanisms remain unclear, and therefore improving our understanding of such mechanisms is an important research objective. This painting is thought to have been created following the eruption of Tarawera from eyewitness accounts. Fieldwork by previous authors found that there were 4 major eruption columns believed to be Plinian, which are also depicted here in the painting. What's not shown are the other tens of eruption jets that were in lower intensity style of eruption along the fissure. Note also the steam or phreatomagmatic eruptions, where the magma interacted with the geothermal system. What's interesting about this eruption is that basaltic magma doesn't typically erupt at such high intensities. We want to understand what special and unusual conditions drive basaltic Plinian eruptions. Eruptive behavior is mostly controlled within the shallowest parts of the magmatic system, involving dynamic processes associated with magma ascent and surface events. We therefore study the shallow conduit processes involved in this eruption to understand the triggering mechanisms of basaltic Plinian eruptions. Tarawera is the only basaltic Plinian eruption with quantitative constraints and visual observations of the eruption dynamics and timing. Here's a map of the Tarawera area. The eruption ripped through a pre-existing dome complex, the most recent material having been erupted in around 1315 AD. The 1886 eruption began at 1:30 a.m. with little warning on the 10th of June from an event in the northeast of Mt Tarawera. By 2:30 a.m., a chain of eruptive centers along the 8-kilometer segment across Mt Tarawera was in a sustained eruption. The fissure cut across the pre-existing Tarawera dome complex, outlined with a dashed white line. The yellow circles are the final locations of Plinian eruptions determined from dispersal measurements. At 3:20 a.m., basaltic magma interacted with an active geothermal system to the south and generated steam-rich plumes and pyroclastic density currents, which destroyed 3 villages. By 6 a.m., the eruption fissure had propagated to the southwest so that the entire 17-kilometer rift was in eruption, dispersing scoria and mud over an extensive area. The event lasted a total of about 4 hours. The deposits of the eruptions are highly complex. The eruption fissure is 17 kilometers long in total. However, the Plinian plumes were only present in the northeastern section. The proximal deposits are shown in this photograph. Here we can see that there are beds that are thick and widespread, which gradually thin with distance from the fissure. And then there are localized beds that thin out quickly with distance from the fissure. Models and calculations of these deposits suggest that the widespread tephra beds have formed due to sedimentation from margins of high-intensity Plinian columns, number 2 in the schematic, and that the quickly thinning tephra beds resulted from sedimentation from low-intensity eruptions, number 4 on the schematic. These are our 2 end members. Other transport regimes during the eruption included clasts being released from near the full height of the Plinian plumes, i.e. the upper margins of the convective region, and direct ejection of ballistic blocks. I'm studying M-member 1 and M-member 2 to understand what the drivers are of each eruption style, so that we can better understand how the magma erupted at such high Plinian mass eruption rates. Here's a bird's eye view of the Tarawera fissure, showing the location of my two M-member sections, from which I have selected clasts from stratigraphy representing the widespread M-member and localized M-member. I also study a third site, the medial section, which is material sedimented only from the high column and represents the highest mass eruption rates. This slide summarizes my research aims and questions. The overarching aim of my PhD is to understand how the basaltic magma erupted at such high Plinian mass eruption rates. Our research question for this study is, how did ascent and degassing histories of the magma influence the different eruption intensities along the Mt Tarawera portion of the fissure? To answer this question, we present a detailed re-examination of microtextures from the pyroclasts deposited both proximally and medially to the fissure. The degassing process is one of the main controls on volcanic eruptions. This is a schematic of magma ascent dynamics during explosive eruptions in a conduit-like geometry. The degassing process involves exsolution of volatiles from melt, which causes bubble nucleation. These bubbles will then expand, coalesce, and in some cases will escape, called outgassing. Typically, in basaltic systems, bubble ascent rate exceeds magma ascent rate, so the gas escapes. This is called decoupled open system degassing. For Plinian intensity eruptions to occur, the bubbles rise at the same time as the magma, and therefore they can't escape. This is called coupled closed system degassing. The magma from the 1886 eruption must have ascended rapidly through the conduit to allow coupled degassing and for the magma to erupt at such high intensities. This type of behavior is unusual for basaltic magma, as viscosity and ascent rates usually would not allow volatiles to stay coupled to the melt. The conduit processes are recorded in the size, shape, quantity, and spatial arrangement of vesicles and crystals. Primary vesicles are signatures of bubble nucleation and growth, which are determined by magma pressure at depth, as well as initial melt volatile content and viscosity. Ground mass crystals, also called microlites, may form in the shallow conduit and increase the viscosity of the melt and limit outgassing. These parameters in turn drive magma ascent rates that can influence fragmentation. Modal density clasts have been carefully selected to be as representative as possible of the end members of mass eruption rate. We can see that clasts from localized proximal sample locations are lower in density than clasts from other deposit locations. The widespread proximal and medial density data are very similar to each other. Here are some backscattered electron images of scoria clasts from each sample location. In black are vesicles, and in grey is the ground mass. The vesicles from localized proximal clasts show larger vesicles which are highly irregular and polylobate. This is a signature of coalescence and explains the class' lower modal density. The vesicles from widespread proximal and medial clasts show more circular to subcircular vesicle shapes, which have probably gone through less coalescence. These textures may suggest a subtle difference in magma ascent histories between clasts erupted at different mass discharge rates. The vesicle number density of a sample is important to calculate for such studies because it's used as a proxy for decompression rate. If an eruption is Plinian, we would expect high vesicle number densities because these types of eruptions occur due to high decompression rates. Here I compare pyroclast textures from eruptions with contrasting decompression rates. On the left is a pyroclast from a strombolian eruption with low decompression rates and thus low vesicle number densities, and on the right is a pyroclast from a Plinian eruption with high decompression rates and thus high vesicle number densities. Here I've plotted the vesicle number density values for my samples as well as values from previous workers. The x-axis is for circularity, and the y-axis is vesicle number density. Each dot represents the vesicle data from one clast. We can see that from my measurements, the vesicle number densities are all very high at around 10 to the 6 to 10 to the 7 per centimetre cubed. It's surprising that there seems to be no discernible difference in vesicle number density between clasts from different eruption intensities. Our data generally agrees with previously published work. Previous workers measured crystallinity from Tarawera pyroclasts and found that scoria from all deposit locations had a similarly high crystallinity. They used this as part of their evidence to suggest that all magma along the northeastern fissure had the same ascent history. However, we've carried out more in-depth analysis to find subtle differences in crystallinity between the different sections. In the top row are BSC images, and in the bottom row, I've made each phase a specific color. Crystal volume percent is highest in widespread proximal clasts and lowest in localized proximal clasts. Small titanomagnetite grains make up the bulk of the ground mass in all widespread proximal clasts. The clasts from the medial section have a higher ground mass crystallinity than localized proximal clasts due to the large pyroxene crystals, but don't contain the high abundance of titanomagnetite grains like we see in the widespread proximal clasts. The presence of the titanomagnetite grains may have played an important role in this eruption due to their ability to nucleate bubbles. Ash particles appear to show similar textures to the scoria clasts. We see a huge contrast in crystallinity between the two tephra packages sedimented from different eruption intensities. Here I've overlaid the BSC images with colors to highlight the crystal phases, and I've added pie charts to demonstrate the contrast between the two sample locations. On the left, we see that localized proximal ash has a slightly lower crystal volume than in the scoria, which suggests that there may have been some post-fragmentation crystallization occurring in the scoria class. But nevertheless, the same textural differences are seen between the two. The bottom left image shows a much higher crystallinity than the average for a localized proximal, which indicates that this ash particle represents contamination from the Plinian plume. This contrast in crystal textures is a new finding, and it reveals something critical for our interpretations of shallow conduit dynamics. We suggest that the magma that ended up in the widespread proximal deposits went through a second stage of crystal nucleation at a high level in the conduit. The magma that ended up in the localized proximal deposits probably spent less time in the conduit, which prevented further crystallization from occurring. All clasts have a significant small void population, less than 10 micron in size. We call them tiny voids. Their shapes are complex, most of them appearing to be modified by the presence of microlites, although some are found surrounded by glass. Number densities of tiny voids are relatively similar between all sample locations, but the widespread proximal class appears to contain the smallest and most angular voids, often being associated with clusters of titanomagnetite. Products from the Etna 122 BC eruption also contain these voids. From the measurement of all vesicle sizes in a sample, a cumulative frequency distribution plot can be used to easily visualize the size distribution of vesicle populations. I've plotted vesicle size versus number of vesicles greater than a given size. Each line represents vesicle data from one clast. We can see that there is a bimodal distribution of vesicles with two peaks. The far left peak is due to the high number of tiny voids, less than 10 microns in size. This high number of tiny voids brings up the vesicle number density to 10 to the 8 to 10 to the 9 per centimetre cubed, as shown in this plot. Including the tiny voids in the vesicle number density calculations would also suggest a higher decompression rate than what was previously published. So, what could these tiny voids be, and what processes do they represent? Work presented by Sable excluded vesicles less than 10 microns from their vesicle number density calculations for both Tarawera and Etna 122 BC eruptions because they interpreted them as dixitaxitic voids, which form as a result of contraction during crystallization and cooling. We've rejected this interpretation because dixitaxitic voids would be completely bound by crystals, but many of the voids in low crystallinity class are surrounded by melt. Our dilemma is that these tiny voids considerably affect number densities, pretty much equally from each sample location. If these physical number densities were indicators of eruption intensity, then the class erupted from low-intensity eruption styles would show much lower physical number densities than those erupted from high-intensity eruption styles. But our data, as well as data from previous workers, shows no difference. This finding suggests that physical number densities in these clasts can't be trusted as indicators of eruption intensity. Here's a graph showing published data from other explosive basaltic eruptions versus my own data. Physical number densities from basaltic Plinian eruptions are typically high, around 10 to the 6 to 10 to the 8 vesicles per centimeter cubed, whereas mildly explosive basaltic eruptions are typically lower, around 10 to the 4 to 10 to the 6 per centimeter cubed. Here's the physical number density data for Tarawera with a 10 micron vesicle size cutoff. I've included both data from my own study and from previous work. Number densities with this cutoff are closer to those of Hawaiian fountaining eruptions, where ascent and eruption rates are inferred to be much lower. Here's the data with a 2 micron vesicle cutoff, which includes tiny voids in the calculation. The vesicle number densities are now exceptionally high, at around 10 to the 8, higher than measurements for Etna and Fontana. If the tiny voids in the Tarawera class are in fact a second subpopulation of very small vesicles, then this would explain the disparity between the published physical number densities for the 1886 eruption and all other very powerful basaltic explosive eruptions, although it probably brings the physical number densities too high for an explosive basaltic eruption. So how did the tiny voids form? Since physical number densities of tiny voids are similar between Scoria and each sample location, we suggest that they mark time during ascent where bubble growth was hindered due to the rapid onset of ground mass crystallization, and therefore increase in viscosity. This rapid onset of crystallization occurred in magma everywhere along the conduit, since all of the magma was ascending rapidly, until it reached very shallow levels. We suggest that ground mass crystallinity is a better indicator of the difference in shallow conduit and vent dynamics occurring along the fissure at Tarawera. This slide will show our eruption model for Tarawera. We suggest that while magma along the axis of the conduit continued to ascend rapidly, a collar of slower ascending melt at the conduit margins began to shift towards decoupled behavior, in which gas escaped upwards and towards the conduit walls. The marginal magma became increasingly outgassed and crystalline until it stagnated along the walls of the upper conduit. Accumulation of this sluggish magma reduced the conduit diameter and enhanced the eruption explosivity. The rapidly ascending magma within the central axis of the conduit was transported high into the Plinian plume, and therefore had less time to crystallize. Eruption product sedimented into the widespread proximal environment represents the collar of cooler, more crystallized magma, whereas products entrained into the high plume and sedimented into the medial section represents magma from the central axis. From the analysis of melt inclusions and pyroxene compositions, authors have recently discovered that eruption products from the widespread proximal environment generally have a much lower magmatic water content than other eruption products. This is consistent with our hypothesis that there was significant outgassing of this magma at the conduit margins. For vents erupting at low intensities, there were transient discrete explosions with fluctuating fragmentation surfaces, where the most intense explosive eruptions cleared out the shallow conduit. These episodic explosions allowed efficient outgassing from magma in the shallow conduit into the atmosphere, and by creating cracks and fractures in conduit walls. A decrease in pressure due to outgassing may have increased the fragmentation depth and decreased the mass eruption rate. The viscosity remained relatively low as the fragmentation surface prevented extensive crystallization in the shallow conduit. Since significant bubble overpressure wasn't reached within the conduit, fragmentation was less vigorous than at the vents erupting at Plinian intensity. Vent wall collapse may have also reduced the eruption intensity and triggered the fluctuating fragmentation surfaces. The pyroclasts ejected from low-intensity eruptions were deposited on proximal locations only and are more vesicular because bubbles could expand and coalesce more within the conduit. Such parabolic velocity profiles that we've shown here have also been described in literature from other explosive basaltic eruptions. Here I present our main findings from the investigation of the shallow conduit processes during the 1886 eruption of Tarawera. The rapid onset of ground mass crystallization hindered bubble growth in all magma. Physical number densities can't be used as indicators of eruption intensity at Tarawera and possibly other volcanoes too. Conduit residence time was a critical factor in creating a wide range of bubble and microlite textures. We link heterogeneity in ground mass textures to a parabolic velocity profile across the conduit. And external processes such as vent wall collapse may also affect the eruption style. That's the end of my presentation. I look forward to any questions that you might have. Also, please don't hesitate to contact me at this email address. Thanks very much. I've dedicated this slide to the Indigenous history of Tarawera. This is part of the initiatives the AESC committee has taken to enhance awareness of Indigenous land on which many of us carry out our fieldwork.